I was not supposed to be fond of either of them. A solicitor keeps his place. He reads wills, records transfers, attends to the machinery of great estates while the people inside them grieve or quarrel or fall in love. And he notes it, as he notes everything, without editorializing. I had managed this for 31 years in the service of the Haverly family. I had managed it when the old Duke died without warning in the middle of a fox hunt, and when his elder son, Charles, inherited the title, and immediately spent a third of the estate reserves on a single season's campaign with the cavalry. I had managed it when word came from the peninsula that Charles, the 11th Duke of Callaway, had taken a fever in a field hospital outside Salamanca and would not recover. What I had not managed before was the letter. Charles dictated it 3 days before the end, to a nurse who was herself too tired to hold the pen steadily but who held it anyway, because that was what she did. He told me this later, not the nurse, but the chaplain who had been present. The chaplain said that her hand had not shaken once, which said everything he thought about her character. I had not yet met her when I heard this. By the time I did, I had already decided she was the sort of person one does not forget. The letter reached Callaway Hall on a gray Tuesday in October. I read it aloud in the library, where the new Duke, Arthur Haverly, younger brother, now the 12th Duke of Callaway by the worst possible arithmetic, stood at the window with his back to me, still in his traveling coat, not yet settled into anything. He was a careful man, Arthur Haverly. The cavalry had made him more so. He had the elder brother's height and the father's jaw and none of either man's ease. He held himself as though he expected to be aimed at from several directions at once and had long since stopped minding. The title sat on him like something he had not asked for, which of course he hadn't. I read. Charles had dictated rather in that field hospital while the nurse wrote, with the directness of a man who knew he had little time and wished to waste none of it. He had met a woman during his weeks of illness. A nurse, the daughter of a curate from a village in Oxfordshire, who had come south when the campaigns began because she could not sit still and her father could not stop her. He had not told her that he admired her. He had not told her much of anything, because he was dying and she was busy and neither of them had been built for speeches. He had told me, through the letter, to find her. Her name was Rosalind Vane. She came from a village called Haverly Crossing, which was, and this was the only levity in the letter, a coincidence of names that Charles had apparently found amusing in whatever way a dying man finds things amusing. He asked one thing of his brother, that Arthur find her and see her settled a house in the village if she'd take it, or a settlement in coin if she wouldn't. Whatever she would accept. Charles had written it in plain terms. She had stayed when she might have left, and she had held his hand when the chaplain was otherwise occupied, and he wanted her cared for. It was the last sentence of the letter that cost me the most composure to read aloud, though I managed it. He wrote, I was not able to tell her what I thought of her. Perhaps Arthur will find a way to tell her what I could not. I leave that to his judgment. Arthur said nothing for a long moment when I finished. Then, how far is Haverly Crossing? I told him. Then we go Friday, he said, and that was that. I had expected on that Friday a transaction. Arthur was efficient in all things. He had inherited an estate in some disorder, and had spent the first 3 weeks of his dukedom riding boundary walls and reading ledgers with the focused economy of a man who views sentiment as a luxury one addresses after the accounts balance. I carried the deed to the cottage, Wren Cottage, a neat place on the east edge of the village that Callaway estate had held for decades and which was currently vacant. It was a good cottage. I thought she would take it. She was in the kitchen garden when we arrived. Not a kitchen garden of the grand sort. This was her father's house, a curate's house, tidy and modest as the man himself. But she was there in an apron with earth on her wrists and her hair escaping its pins in the October wind, and she looked up at 2 men in good coats arriving on horseback with an expression of complete composure. I introduced myself. I introduced the Duke. She said, I've been expecting someone, and took off her gardening gloves with a deliberateness that I would later think of as characteristic. She did not say she'd been expecting the Duke of Calloway himself. I thought that she'd expected a letter, or a factor, or some middling representative, not the man himself. She gave no sign of it either way. We sat in the curate's parlor. It was small and very clean, with a good fire and 3 books stacked on the side table with the spines aligned. She made tea without asking whether we wanted it, which we did. I produced the deed. I explained what it was. I explained Charles's letter, not in full, not the last sentence, but its substance. I said that the late Duke had wished her provided for, and that the present Duke had come to honor that wish, and that the cottage was freehold and the papers in order. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she looked at the deed for a moment without touching it. "No," she said. Arthur, who had not expected this, said, "I beg your pardon." "I'm grateful," she said. "Please believe that I am grateful and that I know the intention behind it, but I didn't stay at his side expecting a reward. I stayed because it was right and because he was frightened and because there was no one else at hand who could sit still long enough." She met Arthur's eyes directly, a thing I noticed, because few people did so without some flinching, and she did not flinch. A house would change what it was. I'd rather it stay what it was. Arthur looked at her for a moment. Then he said you would be difficult. It was not what I would have chosen to say, but something extraordinary happened. She smiled, brief and wry and entirely genuine. "He knew me rather well by the end," she said, "for someone who spent most of the time asleep." I watched the Duke's expression do something I had not seen it do before. Not soften, exactly. More as though something that had been very still in it considered moving. We rode back to Calloway Hall without the deed. He returned to Haverley Crossing 11 days later, ostensibly to discuss an alternative arrangement, a settlement in coin, perhaps an annuity, something she might be willing to accept on different terms. I accompanied him as was proper. She declined the annuity with the same courtesy she had declined the cottage. She offered tea again, and this time Arthur stayed rather longer than was necessary, and their conversation drifted from the question of the settlement to the question of her father's parish records, which she had apparently been helping to organize, which somehow led to a discussion of the filing of estate ledgers in general, and their shared opinion that most men of affairs filed things in the order they thought of them rather than the order they would need them. I noted that this was the longest conversation I had heard the Duke sustain with anyone since the title landed on him. He came a 3rd time without me. I know this because he mentioned it afterward matter-of-factly, as though it required no comment. He had been in the area, he said, reviewing the eastern boundary of the Calloway lands, which did in fact border the curate's village, so it was not entirely a fabrication. I said nothing. A good solicitor knows when to say nothing. By the 4th visit, I had stopped being surprised. By the 5th, I had begun to feel the quiet concern that attends watching a very controlled man encounter something he cannot organize into an orderly file. Arthur Haverley had managed everything since his brother's death with precision and without complaint. He had not, to my knowledge, permitted himself to want anything that was not already on a list somewhere. Rosalind Vane was not on any list. What she was, I had by now sufficient evidence to conclude, was the steadiest person in the county. She had opinions and she stated them without anxiety. She did not perform either modesty or boldness. She simply was what she was, in the same quiet way that the oak in her father's garden was an oak, not trying to be one, simply occupied with being it. She asked the Duke questions and listened to the answers and disagreed with him at least twice per conversation that I witnessed, and both times she was right, and he knew it. In December she came to Calloway Hall, at Arthur's invitation, to see the archive room, which held records pertaining to 3 parishes including her father's and which she had expressed an interest in studying. I showed her in. Arthur appeared 20 minutes later with what he explained was a query about a filing matter, which it was not, or not only. He stayed 2 hours. I arranged tea. It was the archive room of all places that finished it. Not a ballroom, not a garden, Not a grand occasion of any kind, a room full of leather-bound record books and the smell of old paper, with a fire going because the room was cold and she had come a long way and I had lit it before she arrived. He found her at the far shelf, making notes in her careful hand, and said something I did not hear from my post in the corridor. She turned. Whatever he had said, she was still. He spoke again. This time I heard, "I have no deed, I have no letter, I have nothing to offer from my brother's behalf because I have been here so many times that it has stopped having anything to do with him." A pause. Then, "I would like to know if I might come without a reason." "I believe," she said, "you never needed one." What I heard with certainty, because she said it clearly and he was not speaking at that point, was, "Yes." It was not a ceremony, what followed. It was a proposal without a ring to hand, in a room that smelled of old records, from a man who had spent months being efficient about grief, and was not being efficient about anything in this moment. He had asked her plainly, she had answered plainly, and the business of Charles's letter was at last discharged. Not in the form of any provision the letter had described, but in something so far beyond it that I think Charles, wherever he was, would have found it amusing in the way he found the coincidence of the village name amusing. Quietly, privately, with the satisfaction of a man who was right about a thing he never got to say aloud. They were married in February in her father's church, which was small enough that the congregation's warmth was sufficient against the cold. I stood as witness. The register was in good order. I had checked it myself. Rosalind Haverly, Duchess of Callaway, signed her name in the same steady hand that had once held a pen for a dying man and not shaken once. Afterward, when we were standing in the churchyard and she had gone inside to speak with her father, Arthur came to stand beside me in the way he had of arriving next to a person, without announcement. "She was right about the ledger filing," he said. "She was," I agreed. "And the parish records," he said. "Also correct," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Charles knew what he was asking. I thought of the last sentence of the letter, the one I had read aloud in the library on the gray October Tuesday while he stood with his back to me, still in his traveling coat. Perhaps Arthur will find a way to tell her what I could not. I leave that to his judgment. "I believe he did," I said. Arthur looked at the church door, where she had just reappeared in her ivory dress with her father on her arm, and the cold light of a February morning on her face. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not know he was capable of wanting, and has since stopped being able to imagine not having. His judgment was good, he said, as it always was. I said nothing. A good solicitor knows when there is nothing left to say, and when the thing that needs to be said is already being said, wordlessly, by a duke walking back across a churchyard in February to stand beside his wife. I recorded it all, of course. It is what I do, but I have never been able to make myself file it as a transaction.